This video critique of Ayn Rand's contemporary philosophical essay Racism from her book Virtues of Selfishness will be done by myself, Eureeka Forbes, and group members Taeliyah Fernander, Alexis Bodie, Alexandria St.Albord, Cashay Destinae Munroe, and Lachelle. In her essay Racism, Rand depicts this belief as a primitive form of tribalism and crude collectivism. In her opinion, the most important characteristics of a person are their minds, individual actions, and values, rather than a determination based on genetic lineage. Rand's essay Racism highlights a disparity between that era and present day where steps have been taken to reduce anti-minority racism, both socially and in public policy. But despite this shift from forced segregation and openly racist attitudes, racism is still prevalent not only in the United States, but throughout the world.
The conclusion we intend to draw from Ayn Rand's perspective is solely agreeing with her findings. Negroes' economic status didn't change, and instead of finding better ways to deal with it, Negroes fought it back with reverse racism. They believe having whites paid for the actions their forefathers created is equivalent for the treatment they endured for centuries. Ayn said that this type of reaction is just as worse of those who are southern racists because there is no equality and human justice will not be met.
In a 1963 article titled Racism, Ayn Rand condemned racism by describing it as the lowest and by far the most crudely primitive form of collectivism. In her piece, Rand analyzed racism from several perspectives. She used the ideology of collectivism to mend her philosophical arguments. Collectivism, or as Rand calls it, a caveman version of a doctrine, was stated to be the backbone of racism according to Rand. She argued that collectivism promotes the idea that man, as an individual, should have no rights and that his rights should be beneficial to a group or society at large, wishing that group holds the right to sacrifice him at its own impulse and to its own benefit. Rand therefore argued that racism recognizes a man's moral, social, and/or political significance not for what it is, but by their genetic makeup. She insisted that collectivism is to blame for the lack of individual value and the tendency to group one set of people, specifically by race, in a stereotypical box, stripping away the identity of that person along with their rights and freedom. She explored the ramifications of racism by articulating the mindset of racists and showing how they view the minority, or as she bluntly puts it, the Negroes. In addition to this, Rand called out racists for only recognizing a man's appearance or phenotypical features and automatically measures his capability according to this. She stood firmly on her belief as it relates to capitalism being the cure to racism as it values an individual's right greatly. The article argued that in the end, every man accounts for himself in opposition to the idea that genetics or body chemistry and even social background defines who a person really is. Furthermore, the only thing that should matter is one attribute, their productive ability, the core of capitalism.
In the article, Rand proposed that the ideal political economic system would embrace capitalism. She expressed that a fully free capitalist system, which has not yet existed, can be mankind's first step towards freedom, and holds capitalism accountable for the abolishment of slavery in all of the civilized countries worldwide, and also the sworn enemy of cruel countries like Russia, Germany, and the weakest of them all, in her words, England. Additionally, Rand makes her stance known on the idea of collectivism and statism, stating that the increase in racism over the years in America is a direct result of the increase of collectivistic practices and statism. She presented her reading audience with descriptive events and stances as it relates to color and racism, and calls out liberals and conservatives in America. Rand breaks down the reasoning by which conservatives and liberals operate and shows the inconsistencies in them from her perspective. Likewise, she took a non-biased approach by stating the manner in which Black leaders also play a role in their own demise. She addressed the way in which Black leaders are fighting against racism by asking for special privileges because of their race instead of genuine equality. This is, however, seen as reverse racism because it now requires other racial groups to experience inequality and discrimination. Rand also presents the concept of collective racial guilt, where the current white population must pay for the actions of their ancestors, and which she greatly opposes. This notion would be no better than the Southern racists who promoted slavery, because you are then violating another group's individual rights to get your own. She warned her audience not to become victims of racism by succumbing to racist tendencies, and interchangeably the importance in holding Blacks to the disgraceful irrationality of their leaders where it applies. Individualism is of utmost importance to the author, stating that the masses do not exist. It is all about the content of a person independently.
Ayn Rand stresses her definition of racism by describing it as the lowest state and form of collectivism. This principle of grouping individuals based on one's collective group, which include race, gender, social class, and intelligence, previous action, declines their rights of an individual to manifest his or her own true potential. The promotion of collectivism is morally wrong in the aspects of individual rights. An individual shouldn't have to succumb to premises placed upon them that doesn't suit their character or persona. One should be appreciated for one's mindset and values. Each individual should be given the opportunity to display his or her own individuality in society. From the book Elements of Moral Philosophy, Rachel's made reference to an incident that occurred in 1958 between Miss York and an officer. In her defense, she went to the police department of Chino to report her assault, but in return, the officer on duty took inappropriate pictures of her and shared them among his colleagues. Her defiling circumstances were presented in front of a court where she won her case. The whole scenario brought light to utilitarianism and rights. Just like those of color, her rights were taken from her by someone of a superior position for their own personal gain. In reference to racism, those of high positions such as majority, politicians, business owners in places like America, Germany, and Russia abuses their notion of utilitarianism by removing one's rights. Ayn Rand agreed that there should be a unity between both blacks and white in relation to protecting both rights of individuality. By grouping an individual based off of one's race, religious status, or appearance alone can add to cultural stereotyping. For instance, job applications asking for specifics such as your race, religion, gender, and social profile adds more segregation between both groups. Whereas, if one meets specific qualifications of the given position, it shouldn't matter for any of that information. All in all, collectivism can truly be connected as the main reason for racism then and now.
While Rand tries to persuade the reader to denounce collectivism, she also heavily reveres the capitalist economy, and even goes as far as to make very intrepid claims by expressing that this type of economy is the most ideal, as well as the cure for racism, since it caused the abolition of slavery in the past. The author's bias towards the free market system can meet many criticisms, seeing as capitalism promotes monopolies and wealth accumulation for affluent individuals. This act is already prevalent worldwide in non-capitalist economies, so one can note that since this occurs when there is frequent government intervention, many people would be at a disadvantage in this seemingly idealistic economy. In refute, capitalism returns autonomy back to an individual by allowing them to develop creative ways to succeed in a market system. Capitalism subscribes to the ethical theory of justice as fairness that promotes individualism through distributive justice. Persons living in a capitalist country are also allowed to receive what they've earned through their hard work and determination. This is something that all persons would want, as opposed to the harsh regulations of communism and the enormous amount of power held by the government in socialist economies. Another BIOl mentioned by Rand is her stance that capitalism is solely credited for the reason slavery was abolished. This idea was theorized by many due to the slave trade being less than profitable as a result of an increase in industrialism within the middle class, who did not need the assistance of slaves to perform their duties. While this theory is a substantial cause of the abolition of slavery, capitalism cannot take all of the glory, seeing as one can claim increasing morality to be a major impact on why slavery was criminalized. One could even argue that it is selfish and inhumane to state that slavery was only prohibited because the profit margin decreased. For centuries, enslaved persons were dehumanized by the white masses and denied their basic rights. So many would argue that it is only right that persons would develop a more humanitarian way of thinking. Unfortunately for this argument, black people were considered less than white persons, many of whom believed in falsified data that seemingly proved that the minority were inferior. Many racists did not care about the prima facie duty of non-maleficence, as they benefited from the free labor of enslaved blacks. If they were so concerned about the treatment of slaves, they would not have taken them from their homes, bought them, nor forced the enslaved to reside in harsh living conditions. The harsh treatment of blacks from the post-abolition period to now is also a testament to this, as many members of the minority still face harsh discrimination today. To this extent, Rand's comment about capitalism causing the prohibition of slavery is correct, as black Africans were widely considered to be second-class citizens. After Rand's full endorsement of capitalism, she expressed how black leaders were trying to establish a system of reverse racism within the American society. Many of the public figures began to request that racial bias in favor of African Americans be established on the job force, and even for there to be a certain amount of each race represented in schools. Interestingly enough, Rand compared this thinking to the thinking of racist Southerners who wanted to solidify whites' dominant place in America. Despite Rand's severe criticism of this event, an argument could be made that African Americans deserve to have reparations due to the atrocities their ancestors faced in the country, especially since there is still systemic racism that often leaves them at a disadvantage. This way of thinking goes with the moderate deontology theory that states that the duties of reparation and justice are duties that the black community are obligated to. In response to this, there would be a never-ending cycle of injustices if minorities were allowed advantages over others due to past racial issues. It is selfish just to highlight African Americans, since other races too suffered at the hands of the white majority. What the black leaders should be advocating for is equality and equity for all, no matter what race, sex, or creed. Trying to profit off of collective racial guilt will only be to the detriment of society. It is of utmost importance to learn from the mistakes made and to try and leave the an eye for an eye ideology behind. It is not being implied that we should gleefully forgive and forget, but we should acknowledge the transgressions made and try to move forward together, realizing that we must do our part in making the world equal for all.
According to Rand, racism is the most rudimentary and most vile form of collectivism there is. Collectivism is a principle which believes that the group has more priority over each individual within that group, and as a result, refutes the individual from having rights. Instead, the rights of the individual belong to and are a reflection of the group. In collectivism, the group has the right to dispose of the individual whenever deemed necessary. Collectivism believes that an individual's character, moral being, social, and political influence is the result of his or her genetic makeup rather than their own thoughts and beliefs. In short, Rand excoriates collectivism as she believes it is due to the lack of individual identity and value. Therefore, in order to develop pseudo-confidence, one must claim the accomplishments of another as their own. In response to collectivism, Rand suggests that both minorities and majorities unify and work towards protecting the rights of individuals. She suggests that grouping an individual based off of one's race, religious status, or appearance alone can add to cultural stereotyping, and this form of grouping, which is collectivism, is responsible for racism in the past and in the present. Through the course of the reading, Rand condemns racists for not looking beyond a man's physical appearance and judging him based on his phenotypic features. She mentions that a fully capitalist society would be the way forward for mankind as it would result in the freedom of all men. However, this perfect society has yet to exist. Apart from that, she gives credit to the capitalist society, stating that capitalism has had a negative effect on racism. And she even implied that capitalism may serve as an elixir for racism. Rand believed that this could be done because capitalism focuses on and respects an individual's right, and as a result, collectivism cannot thrive or even exist. Rand mentioned that the state of Black people hasn't changed over the last 20 years, and this stunned progress is a reflection of collectivism and statism. In the reading, she mentioned that Black leaders are trying to use reverse racism to seek special privileges for their groups in the employment field and educational system. These actions were also condemned by the writer, and she warns her readers to not fall victim to these racist tendencies. She explained that Black leaders seeking for special privileges or even reparations for the descendants of slaves are no better than racist Southerners wanting to solidify their influence in the United States. Rand concluded that seeking reparations for the pain caused in the past would culminate in the never-ending cycle of injustices if minorities were allowed advantages over others due to past racial issues. In the text, she noted that there were many races who suffered at the hands of white people, and as a result, all of these races would in fact need special privileges due to the fact that their ancestors suffered in the past. Rand believed that the only way forward is to let go of the idea of seeking reparations, acknowledge what horrors occurred in the past, and focus on developing an equal and just society for all.